Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. It's a pleasure to be here, and hopefully you find this a very informative and interesting webinar. So before we begin, just a couple of housekeeping things. If you have any questions, please put it in the Q&A section. The Q&A will be at the end. Just in case we're pushed for time, can I ask that you, if you want to be contacted, if we don't get to your question, that you include your email address or some kind of contact, so that if we don't get to your question, we can respond after the event. And I'm just going to begin now. I'm going to introduce our first speaker, Rosie. So Rosie is a research officer at Cure Parkinson's, and she'll be presenting on the Rallying to the Challenge survey. This is an annual survey designed to better understand how taking part in research and trials can benefit people with Parkinson's and how to tailor these questions to them. Take it away, Rosie.
Thank you very much, and thank you so much for having me here. I'm just going to share my slides before I lose my train of thought. So, as you said, my name is Rosie and I work for Cure Parkinson's. We are a charity that funds research into potentially disease-modifying treatments for Parkinson's, so things that might slow, stop, or reverse the progress of the disease. But I'm here today to talk to you about a survey we've been working on this year in conjunction with a meeting called Rallying to the Challenge. I'm going to tell you a little bit about that survey and a bit about rallying, and then give you some of our top line results. And we hope this might help you understand the potential benefits of taking part in research, and also inform some potential questions to ask before participating, because it can be a really daunting process trying to decide what to do. So for those of you who haven't heard of it before, Rallying to the Challenge is a meeting that's held every year. It was set up by people with Parkinson's, some advocates and their care partners, to help the Parkinson's community understand how they can accelerate clinical research. So this survey, and every year there's a survey written and that's helped to help with discussion at the meeting. This survey was built off the initial survey that was published in 2014, looking at the challenges of clinical trial improvement in Parkinson's. So we wanted to look at the barriers, motivators, and facilitators of participation in clinical trials in Parkinson's, or more simply, what makes participation harder, what makes participation easier, and what is the current experience of participation before, during, and after a trial. It was open to everyone with Parkinson's, so whether or not they had previously participated in a clinical trial. And we also collected a lot of demographic data. And we did this because we wanted to understand who is answering these questions, who is currently participating in clinical trials, and why this might be. So we started off by doing a scan of any relevant literature and resources, of which there's not a huge amount currently. And we collaborated with an amazing group of Parkinson's advocates who really helped shape the questions into the most meaningful questions they could be for them to take forwards, with a team at University of Plymouth, and then also in particular with Dr. Emma Lane at Cardiff University, who really helped to guide and drive this survey forwards. We then presented our top line data, which I'm going to be sharing some of with you today, at the Rallying to the Challenge meeting in Michigan in September. And the survey is now closed and we're in the process of analysing the full data sets. So why have we done this now? This data hasn't really been captured before and isn't generally being done all the time by clinical trial teams. So we want to understand this information because there are more phase 2 and phase 3 trials currently ongoing or about to become ongoing, which require more people with Parkinson's to participate, and generally for a longer period of time as well. So we need to understand what is the current experience of clinical trials and of participating in clinical trials, and how can we improve that? And importantly, how can we make this research more accessible to a broader demographic of people who are more representative of the general population? So this is our interim analysis of the data. This was from September, and at the time we had about 700, just over 700 responses to the survey. Now it's closed, and that was very nearly 800 when we closed it. And that really exceeded our expectations, because if anyone watching took part in this survey, you will know it was not a short survey. So we're really, really grateful to people who stuck through it to the end. And the first thing we wanted to understand is how many of the people that were talking to us through the survey, how many of them had previously participated in a clinical trial. And by clinical trial in this context, we mean things like drug intervention studies, cell or gene therapies. So generally the slightly more invasive clinical trials rather than the observational kind. And of the people we were talking to, just over 80% had not participated. And this is in line with what we were expecting. And of the just under 20% that had previously participated, a majority of them had participated in drug intervention studies. And of both of these groups, there was a fairly even split between male and female, with slightly more male in both groups. And again, this is in line with what we expected. This is all the demographic data I've got for you today, but going forwards, we're going to look at all of our answers in the context of the demographics that we collected to understand how different groups of people see barriers to participation differently, as we think this is going to be really important going forwards for recruitment. So the three key things we wanted to understand were what were the barriers, facilitators and motivators to participation, or what makes it harder, easier, and what motivates people to participate. In terms of the barriers, the top things people tended to indicate were the physical effects of the trial. So the possible side effects or more invasive procedures, and in particular things like brain surgery, as is very understandable. But one thing that stood out to us from the trial naive group, and I should have said we've termed this trial naive for people that haven't participated, and trial experience for those who have, and we appreciate that these are not the ideal terms to be using. However, I'm just going to use them today for clarity, and going forwards we'll hopefully use something else. So the perceived risk might outweigh the potential benefit for the trial naive group. And this was interesting to us because it maybe suggests that the trial experience group had a slightly higher threshold for risk, but also the fact that they maybe have experienced benefits that aren't immediately obvious to the trial naive group. The key facilitator that stood out from both groups was communication, both here in terms of the direct line of communication to the trial team, but throughout the survey that was really picked out again and again as something being really important for participation. So for example, if there are reimbursements of costs incurred during the trial, so for example, your travel to and from a trial centre, is it well communicated how that happens, and is that process easy to complete? One thing that I'm going to come on to again in a minute is the formal guidance for being in an off medication state. So what we mean by this is that participants have stopped taking their medication at least 12 hours prior to an assessment. So when they arrive, they're completely off their medication. And that was really important, that guidance of this was in process. Sorry about the phone. In process for the trial naive group. And I'm going to come on to this again in a second. So in terms of the motivators, the trial naive group were highly motivated by the intervention itself or access to this intervention. However, for the trial experience group, their motivating factors were changed by experience. And what might give some explanation to that could be from looking at what the trial experience group felt they benefited from participating in clinical research. And that's what this graph here shows. So the things that the trial experience group tended to benefit from were benefit to others, being part of something important, an increased knowledge of Parkinson's, being able to spend more time with healthcare professionals or the clinical trial team, something that we anecdotally know to be really important, an improved well-being or quality of life, improved symptomatic management, finding people in the Parkinson's community by actively engaging with Parkinson's, and improved symptoms. However, what's really obvious here is that improved symptoms and symptomatic management is quite low down the list. However, for the trial experience group, it's still a motivating factor. So this does suggest that despite the fact that we need some kind of expectation management in terms of what might happen to your symptoms, particularly in disease modifying trials, and that came out through some of the comments we gained, there's still hope going forwards, and they're still looking to these trials for that benefit. And then we also picked out of the question asking about facilitating clinical trials, so what makes it easier. We picked out different aspects that might that include communication. So just beyond just looking at the direct line of communication to the trial team, something that's really important to the trial naive group was this guidance for things like off medication assessments, for imaging and procedures, guidance for care partners for the same thing. And you can see that it's relatively much higher for the trial naive group in orange than it is for the trial experience group in blue. And we think that this might be because for the trial experience group, by nature of the name, they've experienced these things before. So they have their strategies in place. They know what to do when they're on their way to an assessment of medication because they've done it before and they've practiced. However, for the trial naive group, this is a hugely daunting prospect. And we think that maybe going forward, there could be some way of using this experience and sharing this experience between participation. On top of this, you can see that the trial naive group indicated that they would quite like to have communication with someone independent to the trial team. So a third party, for example, maybe a research buddy, someone that's previously taken part in research and again could share that information, share that knowledge. or something like someone like a community representative, someone they could ask questions to without feeling like they're compromising their position on the trial. And just very quickly wanted to point out here some of the limitations of this survey. Obviously, this was an English survey that we distributed purely online. So we had very few people talking about having different language options and wanting different medias for clinical trial information. However, we anticipate that this is something we'll look more into as we go forwards. So what would make it easier to participate? We took this forward to our meeting in America and asked our focus group, how can we provide better access to trials? How and when can guidance for off-medication assessments be given effectively? How can we put trial naive groups in contact with people who have this experience or someone that's not connected to the trial? How can psychological support be made more clearly available? And if it is available, how do we communicate that? How can we improve facilitation of work and childcare commitments? Again, this isn't something we looked into in a huge amount of detail in the survey. However, it was pulled out quite a lot of the answers, so it appears to be really important for people. And how can we improve guidance and support for care partners? And some of the things that really stood out from this conversation included things like being given really basic information with helpful terminology very early on. So when you hear about the trial, do you immediately understand whether or not you might even be suitable for the trial? Is there an opportunity to ask someone in person questions about the trial? And that would be really helpful in order to facilitate participation at that stage. So thank you very much for listening, and I hope this has given you some insight into participation in clinical trials. I do want to quickly say that there are lots of ways to participate in research that aren't necessarily taking part in invasive clinical trials. Even by nature of being here, you're probably taking part in PD Frontline, which is fantastic. But you can also do things like surveys like this or platforms like Fox Insights. So there's lots of different things to get involved with. And if you have any questions, please do reach out to us. I put our website here on the screen. You can sign up to our newsletter. This was just a really tiny section of our results, so you can be kept informed for when we publish our full results. And you can also watch our top line results at the Rallying to the Challenge meeting. And then finally, some acknowledgements. There are a huge amount of people who helped us build the survey, including Georgia, who's going to speak later. But in particular, Dr. Emma Lane from Cardiff and Helen Matthews from Cure Parkinson's were really influential. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Rosie. That was excellent. So next on the agenda is myself. My name is Helen. I am the research assistant for PD Frontline, and I appreciate many of you are already from PD Frontline or Rhapsody, so I'm going to give a brief overview of the study, but also the importance of the genetics that are involved in our study and what taking part could mean. So, can you all see my screen? Okay, so perfect. So as most of you will know, PD Frontline is an online Parkinson's study, and our main purpose is to be a platform for people with Parkinson's to become essentially trial ready. So we want to recruit as many people as possible who want to take part in research and who wish to know whether or not they carry a genetic risk factor for Parkinson's, to then inform them of relevant trials and studies they could participate in. So there are three main purposes of PD Frontline: to genotype, to act as a registry, and then refer on to clinical trials and studies. So we want to slow down the progression of Parkinson's disease, and the way that trials are moving, there's more focus on gene-targeted therapeutics. The two genes that we test for are the GBA and LRRK2 genes. GBA is the most common risk factor gene for Parkinson's, but most people are unaware of whether or not they carry the change in the GBA gene. So we want to develop a cohort of genotyped individuals who can then be referred onto future trials and also clinical observational studies as well. So This is quite important because, as I mentioned, PD research is at a very exciting juncture where, for the first time, the possibility of drugs that could stop or slow down the progression of Parkinson's is a real possibility. So we want to be able to build a cohort of as many genotype individuals as possible so that when clinical trials or studies become available, we have a whole cohort ready to take part. So I mentioned the GBA gene, but some of you may not know what that is. So I'm going to briefly go over what the GBA gene is, how we inherit the GBA gene, the change in the GBA gene, and what do we know about the relationship between the GBA gene and Parkinson's so far. So we each inherit 2 copies of every gene, one from each parent. This is the same with the GBA gene. People with Gaucher's disease, however, have a genetic alteration in both copies of the GBA gene, and they will pass this on to their child. But someone with Gaucher's will have a genetic alteration in both copies of the GBA gene, so if each parent carries a copy, they would have a 50% chance of developing Gaucher's. People with a genetic alteration in one copy of the GBA gene will not develop Gaucher's disease. This is known as a carrier. They have a slightly increased risk of developing Parkinson's, but this is still a very low risk, and most people will not develop Parkinson's disease. So as you can see here, one gene from each parent means that you have a 50% chance of carrying the GBA gene. So what do we know about GBA and Parkinson's so far? So first of all, the GBA gene makes the enzyme glucose cerebrosidase, or GCase. A lack of this results in a harmful buildup of certain fats and nutrients throughout the body. Alpha-synuclein is a protein that builds up in Parkinson's and causes nerve and cell damage. So what we know so far is that when there's a decrease of GCase, there's an increase of alpha-synuclein. So where there is not a change in the GBA gene, where there is a normal working functioning GBA gene, the alpha-synuclein is broken down and we don't see this nerve and cell damage. But when there is a fault in the GBA gene, the alpha-synuclein is not broken down. Instead, it builds up in the cell and it clumps together, resulting in this nerve and cell damage. So what does the study involve? So we currently have over 2,300 participants, and we recruit all across the UK. Our study continues to grow very rapidly, and for that, I thank you very much for continuing to participate in PD Frontline. Who can take part? Those diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, those who live in the UK, and do not know if they carry the change in the GBA gene. If you are aware that you carry the change in the GBA gene, you will be eligible for our sister study, Rhapsody, which I know some of you may belong to. Signing up to PD Frontline is very quick and simple, taking just 10 minutes. It requires registration, filling out a consent form, and completing a very short survey. The next steps involve us sending you a saliva collection kit, which you will then complete and return to us in a prepaid envelope. The sample is then sent off for genotyping and analysis, and then we do inform you of your results once they become available. So I just wanted to provide a brief overview of PD Frontline and the next steps once you have your results and what this can mean for you. So as I mentioned, PD Frontline will act as a platform, referring individuals to studies where they may be eligible for. So, for instance, those of you who may be GBA positive will be referred on to the Rhapsody study, which is a longitudinal observational study collecting data yearly. This is all done online and involves clinical assessments and a biannual smell test. This will collect data about the progression of your Parkinson's, both with and without the GBA gene, to see how the GBA gene may be affecting Parkinson's symptoms. All participants of both studies will also be referred to appropriate clinical trials and observational studies. For instance, as part of PD Frontline and Rhapsody, we have had several sub-studies. For instance, this year we had the PD Biome study, which looked at the interaction between the gut and microbiome, and all their participants were recruited through Rhapsody and PD Frontline. This was purely an observational study and not a clinical trial, but it's just an example of different ways you may be involved. And these are just the contact details at the end if you want to get in touch if you have any questions. Okay, so thank you all for listening. Next on the agenda is Professor Shapira. Professor Shapira is the principal investigator of both the PD and Frontline and Rhapsody studies. He is head of Department of Clinical Movement Neurosciences at the Institute of Neurology. He will be discussing the upcoming phase 3 of the Ambroxol trial.
Thank you very much indeed, Selene. So I've just got a couple of slides, and I just wanted to emphasize something that Selene said in her excellent introduction to this area, which is that research in Parkinson's disease is changing dramatically. And this is because we have been able to identify genes which are responsible for increased risk in developing the disease. And most important amongst all of these is the GBA gene. We find the GBA gene in about 12% of Parkinson people in the UK. And it's probably a similar figure around the world. So it's by far the commonest. The next commonest, or probably around 1%, is the LRRK2 gene, which we also test for. Now, the change in Parkinson's research that's been so dramatic and is accelerating our work towards developing drugs to slow the disease is based upon these gene identifications, so the GBA and the LRRK2, and new treatments are already now being tested for both these disorders. So what's really interesting is that designing a drug, for instance, for those with GBA may very well have benefits for even those people with Parkinson's without a GBA gene. And the reason for this is because the drugs for GBA-related Parkinson's disease seem to also have benefit on the same pathways in patients and people without GBA mutations. Of course, we can do an awful lot of work, as we have done in the laboratory and using all sorts of different models, but ultimately we need to know whether what we're developing is safe and beneficial for patients, and that's why we need your help and why we set up PD Frontline. And as Selene has said, the moniker is to get trial ready. And I'm going to focus just for a few minutes on a drug called Ambroxol. And Ambroxol is a very interesting compound. It was found almost by chance to be beneficial in reversing the effects of mutations of the GBA gene. So mutation of the GBA gene, an error in the gene, will result in certain changes in the cell. And Ambroxol was found to be capable of reversing those and restoring the function of the cell to normal. In particular, in the context of Parkinson's disease, it was found that Ambroxol was capable of reducing the alpha-synuclein levels in the cells in the brain And Selene reminded you that this protein, alpha-synuclein, is important in Parkinson's disease because it's this protein that accumulates in the brain and is thought to cause nerve damage. So if I could have the next slide, please. What we did a couple of years ago and published in 2020 was what we call a proof of principle trial of Ambroxol. Let me tell you a little bit about Ambroxol itself, first of all. This drug has been around for about 40, 50 years. And it was, first of all, produced as a drug for respiratory problems, in particular for cough. And so over time, it's been found to be very simple, effective, and importantly, a very safe drug. So much so that in Europe, for instance, you can buy it over the counter. You don't need a prescription for Ambroxol. So it's got the advantage of being used for many years and being very safe. What we did in this study with a relatively small number of people with Parkinson's disease, both with and without GBA mutations, was to see if the Ambroxol was well tolerated in this patient population, safe, whether it got into the brain, because of course we need the drug in the brain as opposed to in the lungs, where it's previously been found to be effective, and to see what effect it had on alpha-synuclein. And I'm pleased to say that the drug was positive in all of those respects. So the patients found it was reasonably well tolerated, produced no significant side effects. It didn't interfere with the medication for Parkinson's disease at all. It got into the brain and it did the job that we wanted it to do, which was to reduce alpha-synuclein. So this trial was very positive, and that is what has led us now to the next study. Selene, if you could show the next slide, please. So that has brought us now to Ambroxol in what we've called the ASPRO-PD study, which is Ambroxol to slow progression of Parkinson's disease. And this is a major first in the treatment of Parkinson's disease. This is the first trial to get to what we call phase 3 of a drug which is targeted specifically to a genetic related pathway of Parkinson's disease. So it's a hugely important trial based on a lot of work in the laboratory, but also our preliminary study. And we're going to launch this clinical trial next year. We're going to hopefully start recruiting people for the trial around May. So this study, ASPRO-PD, which is really importantly supported by PD Frontline, the people who will be recruited into the Ambroxol study will come through PD Frontline. So it's what we call a phase 3 double-blind randomized placebo-controlled study. So it's a gold standard study of testing the effectiveness of a drug in clinical trial. The people that we're going to look for to recruit, of course, have to have Parkinson's disease, but we are going to take those with and those without a GBA mutation. Half of our Parkinson patients will have a mutation, the other half will not, which is, of course, is why we need to know the GBA gene result through PD Frontline. We're going to be giving the drug Ambroxol, and we'll obviously need to compare the effect of the drug with what we call a placebo, otherwise often referred to as a sugar type tablet. Basically to ensure that what we're seeing in terms of results are real. Two years is what we call the MDS-UPDRS parts 1 to 3. So what will happen to people who are recruited into the study is that they will start Ambroxol or placebo and will continue on that for 2 years. During that time, we'll see them every 20 weeks. So not a particularly onerous schedule of visits. So only need to come and see whoever is at the center for the trial site every 20 weeks. At the end of 2 years, everyone will be converted to Ambroxol, and they'll know that they're on Ambroxol at that point and continue on that for a further 6 months, and we'll see them again at the end of that. Just an explanation of what we're looking at as this primary endpoint, parts 1, 2, and 3. This is a combination of the effects of the drug on quality of life, activities of daily living, and motor function. And we've talked importantly to the regulatory agencies to check what they will be looking for if they want to consider giving Ambroxol a license for Parkinson's disease. So we believe that we've designed the study as best we can to prove whether Ambroxol is positive or not. And of course, we don't know what the end result of the study will be. We'll obviously hope it's going to be positive, but the whole purpose of this trial is to see whether the Ambroxol really is capable of slowing down Parkinson's disease. People who come into the study will be able to continue their medication as normal. So we're not asking people to change their Parkinson's treatment at all. They'll just be added with Ambroxol or alternatively the placebo. And of course, they won't be aware which of those it is. So that, I think, is the next slide. Selene, if there's one more, there isn't. Perfect. That's the end of the story. Please let me know if you have any questions. If you're keen to consider the Ambroxol study, please go through Frontline. We do have a link on there which will help tell you a little bit more about the study. And early next year, we will be launching with Cure Parkinson's, who are the major sponsor of the study, although they are part of a sponsor consortium. But we will next year be launching more publicity about the trial to help inform everybody. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Shapiro. So next we have Simona. Simona coordinates the Parkinson's Family Project, the purpose of which is to compare closely related people with and without Parkinson's. So when you're ready, Simona.
Hi, Selene. Thank you for a lovely introduction. Let me just share my screen in a moment. And oh, sorry. Oh, sorry about the delay. I can't see the bottom of my screen. Really sorry about the delay.
If you click on slideshow at the top, you'll be able to present from there.
Slideshow, yes, thank you very much. Thank you. Okay, so hello everyone. My name is Simona Yassitita, and I will tell you about Parkinson's and Movement Disorders Families Project, or short, PFP, which is a study based at University College London. And it is a study focused on the genetics of Parkinson's disease. So I will tell you about the aims of the study, about eligibility criteria, about the procedures of the study, the current state of recruitment, how we analyze samples, and our goals for the future. So this is the study team. That's me, the study coordinator. So I coordinate the study sites across the UK. And we have my colleague Megan, who is usually the first point of contact. So if you would like to take part in the study, she'll be the one who will introduce you to the study, go through the consent procedures with you. And we have our newest member of the team, Tatiana, who makes sure that everything runs smoothly and all the administrative tasks are taken care of. And we have Professor Hugh Morris, who is the chief investigator of the study. And I'd like to thank the co-investigators, one of which is Professor Tony Shapiro. So thank you very much. As I mentioned, it is a UK-wide study, and we have 44 recruiting sites across the UK. So if you would be interested in taking part in this genetic study, but you're not based in London, that's not a problem at all. I can always refer you to another site which is closest to where you are based. And actually another option, if there isn't a site close to your home, we also have an option to do remote recruitment and blood sample collection with the help of GP practices. So just a quick slide on Parkinson's disease. So it is the second most common neurodegenerative condition, and it is thought to have a multifactorial etiology involving the role of genetics modulated by environmental exposures. Although the main risk factor for developing Parkinson's disease is advancing age, many common genetic variants have been associated with increased risk of developing Parkinson's, and also several rare variants can cause Parkinson's disease. And for the vast majority of familial Parkinson's cases, so those are individuals, cases where multiple generations in the family are affected by Parkinson's. So for those familial cases, a known genetic cause has not been identified. Family history and early onset of Parkinson's disease are thought to be the main factors associated with non-monogenic forms of Parkinson's disease. So this is kind of the rationale of why we're interested in recruiting early onset individuals with early onset of Parkinson's and individuals with familial Parkinson's disease with several members affected in the family, because a known genetic cause has not been identified for most of these cases. This suggests that more variants out there to be discovered. So the main aim of Parkinson's and Movement Disorders Families Project is to identify gene changes that might cause or increase the risk of Parkinson's and other movement disorders. So it started off as being only a Parkinson's study, but a couple of years ago, we've introduced other movement disorders as well, such as progressive supranuclear palsy, multiple system atrophy, cortical basal syndrome, and essential tremor, and so on. And we want to identify these gene changes by identifying families with early onset and familial Parkinson's disease and movement disorders. And as I mentioned, these are the categories of Parkinson's cases that have a likely genetic cause to their disease. And so our DNA is like a string of 3 billion letters, and it acts as an instruction manual for all the processes in our body. About every 1,000 of these letters, there is a variation between people. And most of the time, this variation is benign, it is not harmful, and it is associated with benign differences between people, such as eye color or hair color or height, and so on. But sometimes this variation in the DNA acts as a spelling mistake and makes the instructions for a body unclear in some cases, and that could be a cause of disease. So we're interested in identifying these spelling mistakes in the DNA in this project. And because it is there is so much variation in the DNA of all individuals, it is quite difficult to pick out which of these variations are the ones that are harmful. Because family members share a lot of DNA, it is very useful to compare the DNA of individuals who are affected by Parkinson's or another movement disorder and their unaffected family members as well. And that is because we can then identify which of these variations are present in individuals with Parkinson's and that are not present in their unaffected family members. And we think that that could help us identify these new mutations. And then a second goal of this research is to establish a network of affected families and patients carrying mutations who are eligible to participate in future studies and clinical trials. So when individuals want to take part in the study, they sign a consent form, and one of the items in the consent form allows you to opt in if you would like to hear about any clinical trials that you may be eligible for in the future. So this would act like a registry of individuals who are interested in taking part as well. And finally, we're hoping that expanding our knowledge on the genetics of Parkinson's disease will help us inform new and better future tests and treatment of Parkinson's. And just to mention the inclusion criteria, so an index case is the first person recruited to the study in the family. So it's someone affected by Parkinson's or another movement disorder. And as well as having a diagnosis, this individual has began experiencing their symptoms before the age of 45. So that is our early onset category. Either or they have one or more affected individuals in their family, or another way to participate is if an individual has already had some genetic testing. Let's say they had an NHS testing and they know that they already carry a genetic mutation associated with Parkinson's or another movement disorder. So they are also able to participate. So early onset or familial or a known mutation individuals. And then, as I mentioned, we also recruit their affected family members and unaffected relatives. And this is what the procedure looks like. So there are slightly more assessments for the affected individuals than the unaffected individuals. So we collect blood samples, slightly more blood tubes for the affected individuals. The participants complete questionnaires at home. The affected individuals complete a questionnaire on their symptoms, and then all individuals compare questionnaires on the family history of movement disorders and other medical conditions, on their own health and on any environmental exposures, medications they take, and so on. We have an interview on the family history. We draw a family tree, and then we complete an interview on the symptoms with affected individuals. We complete a movement assessment, already mentioned by Professor Shafira, the UPDRS, and yes, UPDRS. And then we also complete a very short cognitive assessment called MOCA to see how processes such as memory work in these individuals. Yeah, and just to quickly mention, the DNA samples are, DNA is extracted from the blood samples that we collect, and they're analyzed using a wide range of techniques. At the moment, we're mostly focusing on collaborating with a project called Global Parkinson's Genetics Program, and they help us with whole genome sequencing and genotyping our samples. And those are techniques that allow us to see the genetic constitution of an individual, to kind of unravel that string of letters. So at the moment, I would really like to thank all the individuals who have already taken part. So since 2015, 1,449 participants have joined the study. 1,107 are index cases, so the first participant recruited to the study from the family. We have 67 affected relatives, and we have 210 unaffected relatives who have joined the study. And this is a quick overview of what recruitment has looked like since the beginning in 2015. So we had a big spike in 2016, and then we see also a very significant reduction during COVID times, of course, and now we're back to similar numbers of individuals joining every month to 2019, and about 20, slightly over 20 individuals join the study every month. And just to see who are our index cases, so most of our index cases who've joined the study have a family history of Parkinson's disease or another movement disorder. The second largest group would be early onset participants who began experiencing their symptoms at or before the age of 45. And the third largest group is both early onset and familial patients. And just to look at the future aims, so we have 8 years remaining of recruitment. The study is set to end in 2030, and our recruitment target is 2,400 individuals be recruited to the study. At the moment, we are still hoping to recruit 1,000 participants. We're preparing a baseline research paper where we overview the mutations identified so far. And yeah, we will continue analyzing our samples through the Global Parkinson's Genetics Program. Thank you very much for listening. Here are my email addresses. There is also the website if you would like to learn more about the study. Yeah, please feel free to contact me on any of the email addresses, and yeah, looking forward to hearing from you, and please let me know if you have any questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Simona. That was excellent. So next we have Georgia Mills. Georgia is a project manager for EGS Act PD, a project focused on the setting up of a multi-arm, multi-stage platform for evaluating new therapies for Parkinson's. When you're ready, Georgia.
Thank you. Is that shared? Yeah. Fab. Okay. Thanks, Len. So, as Len mentioned, I'm the research project manager for EGS Act PD. So this is a project that's run by the University College London and University of Plymouth. But we have lots of different people and organisations involved, a few of which are on this call. So we have Professor Tony Shapiro involved, Cure Parkinson's, and Romy as well as part of our core team. So we've got lots of different organisations involved in this project. And I'm just going to give you a bit of an overview of what we're trying to achieve. So what is EGS Act PD? So the Edmund J. Safra Accelerating Clinical Trials in Parkinson's Disease Initiative, or EGS Act PD for short, is a really exciting initiative that's been set up with the aim to revolutionise how we run clinical trials in Parkinson's. So we've set up a large consortium of expert members from across the UK, which includes people with Parkinson's and their carers, and they've all come together because we're all passionate about advancing the delivery of effective Parkinson's treatments. So what we really want to do is improve the efficiency of how we run clinical trials in Parkinson's and speed up how we find answers. And we're focused in this project on potential disease-modifying therapies. So what we mean by that is any treatments that have the potential to slow or stop Parkinson's progression. So how do we plan to transform clinical trials? So you can see here on the screen what a typical clinical trial design might look like. So to start with, you'll have the initial setup process where you'll design the trial, apply for funding, apply for your ethical approvals, get all of your sites on board and trained and ready to open. And then once you're open and are recruiting participants, you'll typically have one placebo arm being compared to one treatment. And so you might run the trial for a couple of years, and once the trial ends, you'll analyse that data, report the results. They might be positive or negative, and if you decide to proceed with another clinical trial, either to do further exploration on a positive result or to look at a new potential treatment, you have to go back and restart that setup process all again. So within this time period, you've only received answers about one potential treatment. And so we want to change that. We want to speed up this process. And the way we plan to do that is by setting up a multi-arm, multi-stage clinical trial design. And so this slide is a little bit more complicated, as you can see. You still have that initial setup process, which is quite a complex process for this type of design. But then once you open the trial, you have one placebo arm, but you're testing that against multiple different treatments all at once, all within the same trial. And that's the multi-arm element. And then as you're running the trial at specific time points earlier on in the trial, you can have a look at the treatments to see how they're doing and whether they seem to be effective. Any treatments that don't appear to be effective can be removed from the trial and replaced with a new treatment. So you can see in this example, treatments 2 and 3 were explored at around 18 months, and they were deemed to be ineffective, so they were taken out of the trial and replaced by treatments 4 and 5. And that's the multi-stage element of the design. So as you're going through the trial, it gives you an opportunity to test multiple different treatments, get answers about multiple different treatments, and you can do all of this within the same trial, which has major advantages in terms of costs, in terms of time. It also means we need a smaller percentage of participants to be on the placebo arm. And then at the end of the trial, you've been able to look at multiple different treatments without the need to end the trial and reset up everything for each new treatment that you have a look at. So there has been previous MAMS designs that have been very successful. So the Stampede trial is a trial for prostate cancer. That's a hugely successful trial. They've already reported 3 practice-changing results, which means they've found 3 new types of treatments that they've introduced as standard of care that can improve treatment for people with prostate cancer. There's also the M&D SMART trial, which is set up for motor neuron disease, who've just recently completed their first analysis of the treatments to see if any need to be removed or if they can be continued. And there's also the Octopus trial, which has been set up for multiple sclerosis, which is opening to recruitment soon. So there's lots of success stories and about setting up MAMS trials, and we thought, why can't we do this in Parkinson's? And so we're taking the learning from all of these trials to apply it to EGS ACT-PD to try and set up the best possible trial for Parkinson's. So our consortium is a very large consortium which has grown over the past couple of years as we've been in this design stage. But the 6 boxes in the middle here represent 6 core working groups, and they've each been set up to focus on a specific element of the trial. So we have our trial design working group, who are focused on the overall design of the trial, our treatment selection working group, which is chaired by Professor Tony Shapiro, and they are choosing the most promising treatments to include in the trial that have potential for disease-modifying results. We have our outcome measures group, and they will be focused on selecting the assessments we'll include in the trial and ensuring they're meaningful to people with Parkinson's. We have our infrastructure working group, who are making sure that sites across the UK have the capabilities to open the trial and recruit participants. And we have our funding working group, who are responsible for securing funding for the trial and hopefully being able to sustain the trial over a long period of time so we can test as many treatments as possible. And then we also have our fantastic patient and public inclusion and engagement group, who are responsible for providing a patient and carer perspective on all of the trial decisions and discussions. And at the bottom there, you can see we also have a wider PPIE network as well, which I'll talk a little bit more about further on in the presentation. So just to highlight how important the patient and carer / partner involvement is in the trial. So as Rosie mentioned earlier, most people think of being involved in research as participating in a research trial, but there's actually lots of different ways to be involved. And one of those ways is to be involved at this early stage and to help design the trial. And that's really important because patient involvement at this stage makes sure we can design a trial that's acceptable and feasible and that people with Parkinson's actually want to take part in. So we have patient and carer members, either 2 or 3 members in all of our working groups. So they'll be present for all of the discussions and decisions that are made around the trial. And then they join together to form our patient and public involvement group, where they'll discuss the trial progress, raise any concerns, flag any issues that we need some further input on, and ensure that we're designing a trial that will work for people with Parkinson's. So we've used lots of different ways to include patient input into our trial decisions so far. So we of course have the feedback, concerns, questions and input from our PPIE working group members. We've also made use of the results of the Delphi survey, which is a series of questions on trial design in Parkinson's, and that was completed by both professionals and people with Parkinson's. And the brilliant rallying to the challenge survey that Rosie spoke to you about earlier has been really, really helpful as well in giving us an idea of the best way to set this up that works for the Parkinson's population. So a few different ways the input has been used in our decision so far is it's helped us to decide the overall length of the trial, the different assessments that we'll use, how we'll deliver the trial, and also how we communicate with participants to engage with them and support them whilst they're taking part in the trial. And another really important factor of the trial and of patient involvement in the trial design is inclusivity. So it's really important for us that we target groups that wouldn't normally get involved in research. So this includes diverse populations in Parkinson's, and there's a number of different reasons that this is really important to improve in research. One is that having a diverse population in a trial increases our understanding of how Parkinson's presents, how it progresses, and how it responds to treatment. And it also helps us further our understanding of any factors that are specific to different populations. So, for example, genetic variation, which has been explored with Brentline and Ambroxol. But most importantly, it's that research should be accessible for everyone who wants to be involved. And so we really want to set up a trial that's accessible and meaningful for everyone with Parkinson's. And so one of the ways we're trying to do this is we're setting up a community advisory panel. So this will include 8 to 10 individuals from diverse backgrounds with chronic health conditions who can provide us with perspectives from different ethnic and cultural backgrounds, different socioeconomic backgrounds, and different geographic locations. So this group will be set up to meet online every 3 to 6 months and provide us with guidance and help us to shape decisions around the accessibility of the trial. And they'll also be able to assist us with a communication strategy for how we target diverse populations and how we can build that engagement and support them to hopefully get involved in the trial when we open. So we're planning to launch the trial in June 2024. We're aiming for 1,600 participants, which is a large number of participants. So it's really crucial that we get the word out and we get people on board and design a trial that people want to take part in. We'll be aiming to open 40 to 50 sites across the UK. So we're hoping for a really wide geographical spread so that everyone that wants to take part will have a local site who's participating in the trial. And we're really trying to focus on a patient-focused trial, so making sure that it's inclusive, accessible, and meaningful, and that participants who take part have a good experience whilst taking part and feel supported on their journey. So we do still have opportunities for people with Parkinson's or carers and partners to get involved at this time point. So we have our PPIE wider network, which I mentioned very briefly earlier. So our wider network is a group of people with Parkinson's or carers and partners who are there for us when we need some broader input on different topics. So essentially, our wider network have agreed to be contacted when we send out requests for input. And these requests for input will vary. We might send out a link for a brief survey. We might ask members to vote on something, or we might send out an invitation to take part in focus groups or interviews. There's absolutely no obligation to reply or respond and give us that input. But it's just a nice, fast way for us to get a larger amount of input on any topics that come up in the trial that our patient members think we need a bit of broader representation on. So if you would be interested in taking part in the wider network, you can find out more information about that on our website, and the application form is on there as well. And I've already discussed our community advisory panel. So applications for that close this week, I believe. But if you feel you'd be able to provide a diverse perspective and help us to make the trial more accessible, that would be fantastic. And again, the information for that is on our website. And the website's just here. It's www.egsactpd.com. There's lots of really great information on there about our trial, our progress, our goals, who's involved. And there's also a contact us feature on there as well. So if you went through the website and had any questions or want any further information, you can contact us through there too. And you can also follow us. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram if you want to keep updated with any notifications of how we're getting on. We post on there regularly, and you can also contact us on there as well. So if you do want to stay involved with how the trial is progressing, then you can drop us a follow on any of those social medias. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Georgia. So we've come to the end of our first section, which is upcoming clinical trials. Before we move on to Parkinson's community, I think it'd be a good idea to maybe answer some of the Q&A questions relevant to the trials that we spoke about. So the first couple of questions I think are for Professor Shapiro to answer. So one of the questions is, will not taking drugs affect people's participation in the Ambroxol trial?
No, people don't have to be on any medication if they don't wish to. So that will not be a bar to joining the trial. If people are on medication for Parkinson's disease, and they and their treating physician feel they need to increase their dose of medication, that too will also be allowed during the study.
When is Ambroxol study likely to report interim findings?
Well, people will be taking the Ambroxol for 2 years, so we hope to be able to have some interim findings after the end of the double-blind phase.
How will Ambroxol be delivered?
It's orally. You just take it orally, 1 tablet 3 times a day. So it's very straightforward. And as I say, can be taken with all of the other medication for Parkinson's disease or otherwise. It doesn't interfere with other types of tablet.
Perfect. Those are all the questions we have about Ambroxol. Yes, so one of the other most common questions was about turnaround time for results for PD Frontline and Rhapsody. So typically it's about 6 months. There has been a delay, which was caused by the pandemic, which resulted in quite a long backlog. So we are working through the results, and you will receive your results once they are confirmed and once they have been corroborated with our analysis, and to make sure that the results are correct and are accurate. So you will be receiving your results. We do appreciate and we are very, very thankful for your patience whilst you wait for your results to be ready. But yes, typically it's around 6 months, or because of the pandemic, it's been slightly extended, but we are working through them. We will also be distributing all of the contact details for everyone here, should you wish to get involved with any of the studies, with any of the other groups as well presenting. I think that is all the questions as part of the trial section. So I think we'll move on now to the PD community. So our next speaker is Kuhan. Kuhan is a member of the Parkinson's community. He's joining us to discuss diversity in Parkinson's and the importance of getting involved in research.
Hi, good morning. I'm Kuhan. I'm hoping you can see my screen. Great, I can see lots of nods. Yeah, I'm Kuhan, and my birthday in a couple of weeks' time. I'll be 48 years old, and the day after will mark 10 years with Parkinson's for me. And I realise I'm not the typical face of Parkinson's, but that's precisely the point. There are many different faces of Parkinson's, and I'm just one. I'm struck by the diversity, the fact that 40% of people with Parkinson's are female, 10% are like me in that they're young onset, under the age of 50, and a similar percentage, like me, are non-white. And I'd like to sort of think of Parkinson's as a condition that doesn't like to discriminate. And I'd like to sort of share some of my insights into my own journey with Parkinson's, and my belated involvement in research activities, and some of the reasons why I was late to the game. And also share maybe some of my insights through my involvement in the race equality group in Parkinson's UK that's looking at some of the barriers to research for some of the underrepresented groups. And I thought I'd start by looking at some numbers. And I know Rosie took us through some numbers earlier, but there is a high-level view that I think is worth noting, that most people with Parkinson's are just simply not involved in research. If you look at the wider population, or if you look at the research services network from Parkinson's UK, which has amassed 7,000 members, that's still only a fraction of the wider Parkinson's population, about 4%. And it's growing, which is great, but it's still relatively small, and only a subset of those are involved in clinical trials. If you look at the mix, the makeup of those research participants, that 7,000, you can see it's broadly reflective of the wider Parkinson's community in terms of age, in terms of age of diagnosis, in terms of the gender mix, slightly more female, but broadly in line with the profile of the wider Parkinson's community. Where it's not, and where there is a significant gap, is the ethnic mix within that base. So less than 5% of the research network is from a non-white background, and if you stack that up against the latest census data that was released last month, which was something like 19%. You can see there's a significant gap. And, I think we need to ask the question why. And if I can just relate this to my own journey, I was, like I said, diagnosed 10 years ago in January, but it's only in the last year or so that I've been actively involved in research. So, why did it take so long for me? And some of the answers to this, I should say, are not specific to ethnicity or culture. I think some of this cuts across barriers to anybody from whatever shape or size they are, or color or gender. I think a lot of this is common themes of barriers, but some of it is specific to cultural nuances, and I'll try and explain some of mine. And I think from what I've seen, that's broadly reflective of some of the barriers from other ethnic groups. So I call those factors, those barriers, the AAA factors, the acceptance, awareness, and assurance, or rather the lack of acceptance of my condition, the lack of awareness of research, and a lack of assurance. And what I mean by that is trust, and I'll explain what that means in a moment. But those three prerequisites need to exist for me to take part in research. And I'll just delve into a little bit more detail as to what I mean by each. Acceptance. Like many people with Parkinson's, 40% or 37%, I hid my condition for many years, and that number rises to 62% when you look to young onset Parkinson's. And the main reason for that was embarrassment, quite frankly. And I didn't know it, but I was in denial. And I was going through a grieving process, and I've written a blog on this, which I've left a link to below. And I think we need to understand, for many reasons, what the journey that people go through, and the journey to acceptance, because it can, in some cases, be quite a long journey, and that's to the detriment of the individual, but also to the detriment of their engagement in things like research. And taking part in research really would have been a sort of further dose of reality for me. So I avoided it. I didn't talk to friends and family much in the early years about my condition. In the first few years, I could count on one hand the amount of people that I told. And in the case of my family particularly, I wanted to sort of protect them. I think this is slightly a cultural thing. I didn't want them to worry. And in more extreme cases, from what I've seen, that need to protect, or perhaps that feeling of embarrassment as well, in some cases can lead on to feelings of shame, and shame on the individual that they feel, but also shame on their family and community. And particularly in Asian communities, that's a very, very strong factor. And all of that leads to further isolation and further disengagement. Awareness. I don't think we're sort of talking loud enough about research, quite frankly. I think we need to turn the dial. My first involvement in research came when somebody just reached out to me directly and asked me to be involved. And I was very happy to be involved, but that was the first time I was asked, and that was probably 5 or 6 years into my journey. I think we're too passive in our approach, putting things on a website or expecting people to search on social media for this stuff, or a lot of people aren't engaged in that way. A lot of people aren't taking part in these discussions. A lot of people aren't involved in these Zoom calls and steering groups and so on. The vast majority, as you saw from the numbers, are just not engaged. I also think language plays a role here, and I don't just mean English language. I mean what I see as a disconnect between the research world and the sort of language and terminology that's used there, and the everyday language that's used by people with Parkinson's, the patient community, and their loved ones. At times it feels like it's a different language, and quite frankly, I need an incentive to take part in research. Simply saying that, you know, it needs to be inclusive and messages around accessibility, it's not enough. I need an incentive, and for me, it wasn't a financial incentive. What sparked my interest was understanding, just like age and gender. I'm pretty sure that my ethnicity is playing a role in the flavor of Parkinson's that I have, and the symptom profile that I had. And I read one article, I remember, that suggested that people from a South Asian background may be more prone to dyskinesia. And certainly anecdotally, I can believe that. And that was the hook for me. And I think people need a hook. And then assurance. I had a very long, frustrating diagnosis process, which took the best part of a year, and it left me somewhat disillusioned. And I'm not alone in this. 1 in 3 takes over a year to get diagnosed. 1 in 4 have a misdiagnosis within that. And this really shapes their outlook with the medical and research community thereafter. It's, you know, nothing short of a traumatic process. And when you're not able to get answers to the most basic questions, it leaves you very disillusioned. Coupled with the fact that I was assured or had promised, and this is my interpretation, that there would be a significant breakthrough or cure in a number of years. And you know, it's been a decade for me, and I'm wondering how many more years it's going to be. And I'm not begrudging any of the great work that happens in the research community, but I think researchers have a obligation, a responsibility here to be balanced in their reporting of research activities. A breakthrough for a researcher is not necessarily a breakthrough for me. And when I see headlines in the press about a miracle cure, or more importantly, when my family see headlines in the press about a miracle cure, it raises those hopes, and often those hopes are dashed, if not delayed. So I think we need to be a bit realistic. There's great stuff happening, but I think we need to manage people's hope. And I remained hopeful, and I still do. But I remain sort of balanced in my outlook, and I'm focused on sort of living well with the condition today, and I think that's absolutely possible. And there are a couple of more A's that I'll throw into there is apathy and accessibility. Apathy is a real killer. You combine it with fatigue and rigidity and anxiety and mood fluctuations. It's like a weight that bears down on you, stops you doing things that you might want to do, or leaves you just, you know, lost in certain ways. I think we need to recognize that and make it easier for people to take part in research. One of my other triggers for taking part in research was COVID, was lockdown specifically, because it gave me more opportunity to do things online. And it just made things a lot easier for me. And it also made me realize that research is more than just clinical trials, and clinical trials is more than just about taking drugs. And that was something that I wasn't aware of. And it was something that was an eye-opener for me. And I just briefly touch on, lastly, my involvement with the Parkinson's UK Research Equality and Research Group, and where I see many of these themes echoed. And I'll leave you with a quote there, which is actually from myself. And there's a few other quotes and great insights from that group, which you'll be able to find on various blogs on their website. Yeah, that's it from me. That's my story. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Kuhan. That was very interesting and very informative. So last but not least, we have Donna from Move Into Wellbeing. Donna founded the Move Into Wellbeing exercise group to dance class for people with Parkinson's and mobility restrictions.
Hello, thank you very much for having us. And this has been a very inspiring morning for me. My father had Parkinson's for over 30 years, and he was involved in many clinical studies at University of Rochester in America and at the Denver Institute in Colorado with some very specialized doctors. So to learn more about where things are at now is very fascinating for me. Our charity is a small but far-reaching one. We have over 10 to 12 classes per week. We go into care homes. We give classes in church halls. We live stream. We have an archive library of exercises people can touch into anytime, any day. We also, very importantly, along with the dance and movement, we like to feel that we provide a sense of inclusion and community. So carers come, family members come, it becomes a social network, a sense of belonging is provided by us. We also have little coffee and tea socials where we bring up different topics to discuss, or we learn about people's backgrounds and we share things. So it's not just to come and do the class and leave, but to have a sense of continuity and care for our community and care for the people in our groups. I think the best way that I would like to share a feeling of what we do is by introducing and sharing two videos with you. These were both made as gifts to our charity, and they were made by people who came to us and asked to make these. One is made by a woman named Özge Özdemir, who's a BBC correspondent with Turkey, and she runs something called Dance Journals, and she goes around the world and she gets inspired by anything that reaches out to her that's involving dance and human beings, and she makes little videos and then she has them on her YouTube channel. So she's made one for us for Move Into Wellbeing. The most recent video was made by Team Lewis Foundation, which is a foundation that works with small charities. Again, they came to us and they were interested in our work. They've made a video that's highlighting a younger person with Parkinson's compared to our regular members. And they wanted to kind of showcase this different way of seeing Parkinson's, as a lot of you have discussed and brought up all these topics already today. So I would just like to, Selene, please go off to the videos and then I can answer any questions you might have afterwards.
My daughter was around there and she said, "Where have you been, Dad?" I said, "I've been to ballet for Parkinson's." And she said, "But it's ballet, Dad." And I said, "Yeah, but it's for Parkinson's." And she said, "But it's for ballet, Dad."
My name is Donna Schönherr, and I am the founder and director of the charity Move Into Wellbeing. Well, why was this charity founded? Why did you found this charity, Donna? And make your life a very, very busy and challenging one. And that's because my father had Parkinson's for over 30 years. So my whole sort of teenage into adult life was witnessing his decline and his suffering. My inspiration was definitely because I wanted to do something to help people, because I knew how horrible it was to have this condition.
One morning, I'd woken up and I was sitting on the edge of the bed, and my wife said to me, "What's wrong with you? You've been sitting there for like half an hour." And I said, "I don't know." I said, "There's something happened to me through the night." And I looked into it myself, and some of the symptoms I was getting, like shuffling feet and stooping, feeling like I was carrying weight on my back all the time, tremor in the hands, all sorts of different symptoms. You know, it made me go to my GP and say, "Look, could this be Parkinson's?" And that was her answer to me. "Don't be so ridiculous. You're far too young. Go and get yourself fit. I don't want to see you for 3 months." And those words have rung about in my head for years now. Well, I walk around with this disease every day, and I was determined to do something about it, rather than sit on my backside and do nothing. Move Into Wellbeing is sit-down ballet exercises. Well, I've been there for 8 or 9 years, and I've met so many great people.
We will start just getting used to the tempo on the spot as we normally do. Yes, so you will have a nice clear sense of rhythm going on in your legs. Right heel, left heel, right heel.
I think there's a certain type of depression that can go with Parkinson's. But when I see my friends in the classes, I really do see the benefits that we all have. The exercises, the moves we do are particularly for Parkinson's, and they benefit us. But I think it's the whole social side of it. You know, you see at the end of the class, we're all smiling, we're all laughing.
We have this, what used to be an annual fundraiser called a dance showcase that's coming up, and huge amount of effort goes into it, as you can imagine. So at every class, we start rehearsing pieces that are going to be in the showcase. It's stressful enough as a performer to get up and perform, but for people with, you know, disabilities and Parkinson's and so forth and so on, it's a huge challenge. But they do really love to do it, and they really rise to the occasion, and it's extremely fulfilling, and the audience usually goes nuts for Moving to Wellbeing performers.
Moving to Wellbeing, I don't know how they do it, to be honest, because they're obviously charity funded, and it's tough, and I'd be absolutely lost if we were to lose this.
Thank you. So if we could just go right into the segue into the next video, please. Thank you.
Moving to Wellbeing is a specialized dance and movement class that's made for people with mobility issues, neurological issues. It primarily started for people with Parkinson's, but it's expanded based on need and desire and necessity. My father had Parkinson's disease for nearly 30 years, and I was a professional dancer on the side of those years, and I always was thinking, how could I do something that could help people? Could I do something? Was there anything out there that would help people with movement problems? And then I started researching, and some of my colleagues were working with dance and Parkinson's. So when I had a little bit of time in my life here, I started to think I want to found a program to be able to offer dance and movement for people with Parkinson's, to help people have less suffering in their lives, physically and mentally. People move to music, they hear the rhythm, it's something very instinctual, and it's something very grounding and something very communal. So then when people dance together, people with all kinds of problems or conditions, those kind of get forgotten about during the time we're in class together because of this primal aspect of music and movement.
I think for what I can see, of course, when they come to class and when they leave, I can see that they really come very much for the community that's around it. So that really the moment of sharing, having a chat with their friends. Now they are friends, really. That we are a little family.
Last position, parallel. We're here. Last time. Close. And open. Close.
It does affect me a lot emotionally, in good ways, but also sometimes bad ways. Unfortunately, we had some losses already of some people, and that you feel that after years teaching them. So that's emotionally sometimes hard to handle, but the good thing is that we are a team.
It's like you get to give this gift to people every week. No strings attached, you just give a gift that you have. And it's highly rewarding. It's very emotional sometimes. It's just extremely rewarding to have something that you can then give, and give with your colleagues, give to people that you know and you see brings good things. So it's like a drug. It's just a happy, wonderful thing. Very demanding on time and mental things, but highly rewarding. So it's like a blessing, really.
Mm-hmm. And I guess you have been also honoring your memories, your life with your father.
Yeah. So I was telling someone today, every class before I start, I have a little dedication inside of myself. So it's like, I feel his presence sort of in a way, with us together.
Hope you all enjoyed that.
So that brings us to the end of the webinar. So I will be going through some of the questions and we can answer them now. So first of all, before I begin the Q&A, thank you all for attending. I thank you to all of our presenters for being here and for doing some very, very excellent presentations. So we have one more question about Ambroxol, which is, if they are taking part in another trial, another drug trial, will they be excluded from Ambroxol?
Yes, if the person is taking the study medication, they will not be eligible for Ambroxol, because obviously we can't study two drugs at the same time. But if they complete the previous study and leave 3 months between, they will then become eligible for the Ambroxol study. So we've got to have 3 months study-free drug period before starting the Ambroxol study.
Thank you. Next question is probably best for Donna. So these dance classes take place in West London, you said?
Yes, we're based in West London presently, but we also live stream some of our classes, and we also have an online library of exercises that are all defined and specified what they're good for. all anyone has to do is reach out to us, and we can try to help anyone who wants further information.
So people could take part from their home as well as coming.
Exactly. And many do. I think that's what one of the gifts that COVID gave us, that was a positive gift and has stayed with us.
That's excellent. So as I mentioned to some of the responses, some of the questions in the Q&A section, I will be distributing the contact details for everyone who's spoken today. So if you have any questions directly related to the presenter, I can provide that all to you. So another question was about encouraging Parkinson's patients at a hospital level to take part in trials and studies. So as Simona mentioned, I think there's 44 hospitals that help them recruit for Parkinson's Family Project. We have about 16 NHS sites throughout the UK also helping us recruit. So the way that the hospitals would help us is they would have to be working directly with us in order to help us and to spread the word. So if you've not heard about these trial studies through your hospital, it's likely they're just not one of our recruiting NHS sites. I don't believe there are any other questions coming in. How long will Ambroxol study be open for recruitment? Prof's left. Okay, so I think I can answer this. So the recruitment window for Ambroxol is 6 years from start to finish. So each participant in Ambroxol will be participating for 2 years with the 6-month extension, but the total recruitment time is 6 years. I think that's all the questions that we have for everyone. So if there's no more questions, I would like to thank you all for joining. There will be a link provided to watch the webinar on demand after probably in January now, and there'll be closed captioning for that as well. And like I said, I will distribute all the contact details for all the presenters here today. Thank you all for joining. Have a lovely rest of your day.
Thank you very much. Very interesting.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks.
Thank you.